It is January of 1924. The sky above the deep, shadow-drenched valleys of the Pacific Northwest did not offer the mercy of soft, white snow. It bled liquid glass. A meteorological nightmare the old indigenous elders and seasoned pioneers called the Great Silver Thaw. For weeks, a bizarre and cruel inversion of temperatures had trapped a layer of warm air high above the freezing valley floor. The rain fell continuously, and the moment those heavy drops touched the earth, the timber, or the rooftops, they froze solid. In the booming, wealthy timber settlement of Oakhaven, the grand, imposing mansions of the lumber elite are currently succumbing to a slow, suffocating, and terrifying death. Silas Thorne, the town's wealthiest lumber baron, paces frantically inside his freezing, luxurious parlor. His breath forms pale, desperate clouds in the dead air of his own home. Outside, his massive, rigid firewood storehouses, fortresses built with over $300 of the finest, straightest milled pine, reinforced with heavy iron bolts, are failing completely. They were designed by expensive architects to conquer the elements through sheer, stubborn mass and rigid strength. But nature has absolutely no respect for the arrogant geometry of men. The flat, heavy roofs of Thorne's storage sheds are accumulating tons of solid, unyielding ice. The rigid, unbending walls, locked completely airtight to keep out the howling wind, have fatally trapped the dampness inside, freezing the millionaire's massive, expensive reserves of premium oak and pine into useless, unburnable blocks of solid ice. And then, the terrible sound echoes through the frozen, paralyzed valley. The sharp, violent, deafening crack of thick timber snapping under the crushing weight of the storm. The millionaire's $300 fortress has collapsed, burying his only source of winter heat under a devastating tomb of shattered, rigid wood and jagged ice. The elite are freezing in the dark. But 3 miles down the valley, where the town's refuse ends and the wild, untamed riverbank begins, a profoundly different reality breathes in the absolute silence of the storm. Here, the savage wind does not howl and batter. It whispers. It is forced to glide smoothly and harmlessly over a strange, humble shape in the dark. It is a curved dome, an organic, low-tech woven shell of living willow saplings and hardened river clay. Inside a small, patched-together cabin just steps away from this strange structure, the air is not freezing. It is thick with the sweet, radiant, life-saving heat of a roaring hearth. Clara, a marginalized widow cast out into the biting cold just months prior with nothing but 2 shivering children and exactly $7 to her name, sits peacefully in a wooden rocking chair. Her infant daughter sleeps soundly against her chest, her small cheeks flushed with profound, comforting warmth. On a braided rag rug, her 6-year-old son plays quietly in the golden, flickering light of the flames. The fire crackles, steady, aggressive, and perfectly, impeccably dry. Outside, the ice storm is violently shattering the heavy, iron-braced sheds of the wealthy. Inside Clara's stove, the wood burns hot and fast, pulled daily from a simple $7 woven basket that the entire town had mocked as a primitive, pathetic joke. Nature is destroying the arrogant elite, but nature is fiercely, tenderly protecting Clara. How does a marginalized woman, stripped of her dignity, her home, and her security, outsmart the wealthiest, most prideful engineers of a booming timber empire? How does a handful of flexible, raw twigs pulled from the mud defeat a climatic anomaly that crushes thick, expensive steel and rigidly milled lumber? To understand the profound, poetic justice of this freezing night, we must leave the warmth of Clara's fire and journey back to the bitter, unforgiving autumn. we must look closely at the dangerous nature of human pride. Pride, you see, loves straight lines. It loves towering, rigid walls, sharp corners, and the dangerous illusion of absolute control over the earth. Silas Thorne built his vast fortune on violently cutting down the ancient, curving, chaotic forests, forcing them through screaming steel saws and turning them into straight, uniform, profitable commodities. He believed that what could not be sold in a ledger had no earthly value, and in his cold, calculating ledger of profits and losses, Clara, a grieving mother whose husband had just perished of a brutal fever in Thorne's own logging camp, was nothing more than a financial liability. The autumn wind carried the first bitter, bone-chilling warning of winter when the eviction notice was heartlessly nailed to Clara's door. Her husband, a man who had broken his body hauling heavy timber to build Silas Thorne's wealth, was barely cold in the ground. In the calculating eyes of the lumber company, the small, company-owned workers' cabin was meant for able-bodied, profitable men, not grieving widows and hungry children. Silas Thorne arrived in person to deliver the final blow, his heavy leather boots stomping onto her wooden porch with the weight of unchecked authority, a gold pocket watch ticking away his absolute lack of patience or empathy. He did not see a desperate mother holding a fragile infant. He did not look down at the young boy clinging in terror to his mother's skirt. He only saw company property that needed to be aggressively cleared for the next season's workers. With a voice as cold and sharp as the frost settling on the windows, he gave her 48 hours to vacate the premises. It was not physical violence, but it was a deeply violent act of the soul. A quiet, bureaucratic, economic execution designed to erase her from his pristine, profitable town before the snow fell. The town watched in suffocating, cowardly silence. The wealthy elite, the well-fed foremen, the merchants who lived comfortably in houses built of Thorne's timber, they all looked away, burying their guilt beneath their thick, warm wool coats. It is a tragic, repetitive cycle of the modern age. How quickly a society will abandon its most vulnerable members when intimidated by the dark, towering shadow of wealth. They whispered behind closed doors that Clara would not last the month. The impending winter of the valley was notoriously lethal. Without a proper, expensive, industrialized woodshed to keep winter fuel completely dry, a family in this valley would simply freeze to death. The men of the town spent hundreds of dollars building heavy, square, airtight fortresses, firmly believing in the absolute superiority of iron nails, the rigidity of sawn planks, and the brute force of human industry. They looked at Clara, walking away toward a barren, flooded plot of unwanted land by the riverbank, holding her children's hands and clutching a meager $7 in her pocket. And they looked at her as if she were already a ghost. They dismissed her as a pathetic victim of circumstance. They did not know she was a silent guardian of an ancient, forgotten intelligence. But the arrogant always forget one fundamental, inescapable truth. The earth does not charge a fee for its supreme wisdom. The soil, the wind, and the flexible branches of the forest have survived 1,000,000 brutal winters without a single coin ever changing hands. Before we witness how the brilliant, low-tech engineering of the ancestors completely humiliated the arrogance of the timber baron, I invite you to join our circle around this warm fire. If you believe that ancient wisdom, deep humility, and the unstoppable force of nature can still triumph over the cold, mechanical cruelty of modern greed, please subscribe to this channel and leave your like on this video. Share this story of resistance with those who need a powerful reminder that true strength never comes from a heavy wallet, but from a quiet, observing spirit. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching this story unfold? Let us know where the guardians of true knowledge are gathering today. The exodus from the rigid, mechanized heart of Oakhaven was a quiet, agonizing procession of three. The autumn wind, already carrying the biting, metallic scent of impending snow, whipped fiercely at Clara's thin woolen shawl as she walked away from the only security she had known. She held her 6-year-old son by his small, trembling hand, while her infant daughter was strapped tightly to her chest, shielded from the freezing gusts by the worn fabric of Clara's coat. Beneath her boots, the perfectly leveled, crushed gravel roads of the wealthy lumber town slowly gave way to the chaotic, untamed mud of the river valley. They were walking toward the absolute fringe of society, to a miserable, unwanted strip of flood-prone land that the timber company had deemed too unstable to build upon, and thus cheap enough to lease to a desperate widow for pennies. The physical toll of that walk was heavy, but the psychological burden was a suffocating weight. To be poor in a town built on the worship of massive, industrialized wealth is to be treated as an error in the grand ledger of progress. The elite of Oakhaven looked upon poverty not as a tragedy, but as a moral failure. As Clara trudged past the towering, freshly painted manors of the company foreman, the curtains twitched. Eyes watched her from behind thick, expensive glass, safely insulated from the elements by roaring furnaces and thick, straight-cut timber walls. No one offered a cart. No one offered a blanket. They simply watched the widow fade into the encroaching gray mist of the riverbank, a disposable casualty of their booming, ruthless economy. When Clara finally reached the barren plot of land, the reality of their survival settled upon her shoulders like a heavy, frozen stone. The only shelter on the property was a dilapidated, long-abandoned trapper's shack. Its roof sagged dangerously. Its wooden walls were warped by decades of moisture, and the wind whistled a mournful tune through the wide gaps in the floorboards. It was little more than a wooden tent. Yet, as Clara pushed open the rotting door, her eyes immediately found the only thing that mattered: a heavy, stone hearth built solidly into the far wall. It was intact. It was functional. But a hearth is nothing without fuel, and fuel is utterly useless if it is not bone dry. The unforgiving mathematics of a northern winter are absolute and non-negotiable. To keep that shack warm enough to prevent a child from freezing to death in the dead of January, Clara would need cords upon cords of hardwood. She could forage the deadfall from the surrounding forest. She could drag fallen oak and birch from the damp earth. But where would she put it? The tiny shack barely had room for a bed and a table. If she stacked the wood outside in the open, the relentless autumn rains and the heavy winter snows would saturate the timber. Wet wood does not burn. It smolders, it smokes, and it steals the heat from a fire, suffocating the flames and leaving the hearth stone cold. To survive, she needed a woodshed. Clara reached into the deep pocket of her skirt and pulled out her entire life savings. $7 bills, crumpled and damp. In the heart of Oakhaven, a standard milled lumber woodshed, built with thick, rigid pine planks, heavy iron hinges, and a waterproof tar paper roof, cost upwards of $300. It was a staggering, impossible sum. The lumber barons believed that the only way to defeat the crushing moisture of the valley was to build airtight wooden vaults, sealing the wood away from the world in heavy, rigid boxes. Clara looked at her $7, then she looked at the chaotic, tangled bank of the river, thick with wild, reaching willow saplings and heavy, dark clay. A deep, ancestral memory, inherited from her grandmother, who had lived long before the screaming metal saws conquered the valley, began to stir violently in her blood. She did not need rigid, expensive walls to fight the wind. She needed to invite the wind to do her bidding. It was a week later, under a slate-gray, threatening sky, that the deep humiliation occurred. Clara was knee-deep in the freezing river mud, her bare hands raw, scratched, and bleeding from stripping the leaves off hundreds of long, flexible willow branches. Her skirt was soaked, heavy with freezing clay, but her eyes were focused with absolute, burning intent. She had begun to plant the thickest willow poles in a wide, sweeping arc, weaving the thinner, pliant branches between them in a tight, meticulous pattern. She was not building a box, she was weaving a giant, inverted basket directly into the earth. The heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves broke the silence of the riverbank. Silas Thorne, draped in a magnificent, heavy black bearskin coat, sat atop a massive gelding, accompanied by his chief foreman. They had ridden down to inspect the river for a potential new logging flume, but they stopped dead in their tracks at the sight of the widow toiling in the mud. Silas looked down from his elevated position, a cruel, incredulous smirk spreading across his face. "Widow Clara!" His voice boomed over the rush of the river, heavy with condescension and arrogant amusement. "What in God's name is this primitive squalor? Have you lost your mind to the cold?" Clara slowly stood, wiping a streak of dark clay from her frozen cheek. She looked up at the towering figure, her posture straight, her voice quiet but entirely unbroken. "I am building a shelter for my winter wood, Mr. Thorne." The foreman let out a loud, barking laugh, slapping his leather-gloved hand against his thigh. Silas shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing in pity mixed with deep, philosophical disgust. "A shelter? With twigs and mud? You're weaving a basket for your firewood, woman. Do you think you are a bird building a nest?" "It is willow, sir," Clara replied softly, her hands resting on the supple, woven frame. "It bends. It breathes." Silas Thorne leaned forward over his saddle, his face hardening into the harsh lines of a man who believed his wealth made him a master of physics. "Wood needs heavy, airtight walls to stay dry, widow. It needs rigid pine, overlapping joints, and an iron roof to keep the rain out. I sell the finest lumber in the state to men who understand civilization. My sheds cost $300 because they defeat the elements with sheer, unbreakable strength. The first winter gale will tear your pathetic little twig basket out of the mud. The rain will soak right through those gaps. Your wood will rot, your fire will die, and the town will have to dig 3 graves for you and those children before February." He looked at her raw, bleeding hands, then down at his own pristine, expensive leather gloves. The contrast was a visual manifestation of their two worlds, the brutal, bloody reality of survival versus the sterile, detached arrogance of extreme wealth. "How much did you spend on this? This garbage?" Silas mocked, gesturing with a riding crop at the woven frame. $7, sir," Clara answered evenly. "For a spool of strong hemp twine. The earth gave me the rest." Silas sneered, violently pulling his horse's reins to turn back toward the wealthy town. $7, he scoffed, his voice carrying away on the bitter wind. "You cannot buy survival for $7, widow. You are relying on the dirt, and the dirt will kill you. When your wood freezes solid, do not come crawling to my door begging for a warm hearth." They rode away, their laughter echoing cruelly through the naked trees, a brutal chorus of the elite mocking the marginalized. They rode back to their rigid, airtight fortresses of milled pine, fully convinced of their intellectual and financial supremacy. They did not understand thermodynamics. They did not understand the Bernoulli principle. They did not know that the flexible, yielding curves of the wild willow possess a structural genius that rigid, unbending lumber can never replicate. Left alone in the freezing mud, Clara did not cry. She looked at the fresh blood on her hands, then turned her gaze back to the beautiful, unbroken curve of the willow wall. She picked up another pliant branch, weaving it tightly over and under, locking the tension into the structure. The arrogant elite believed in fighting the storm. Clara, armed with $7 and an ancient silent wisdom, was preparing to let the storm work for her. To understand the profound miracle of what Clara built on that desolate riverbank, we must first unlearn the arrogant architecture of the modern world. We have been taught by the wealthy, by the industrialists, and by the engineers of the elite that survival is a matter of brute force. They tell us that to defeat the bitter cold, we must build thick, unyielding walls of straight-cut timber. They tell us that to keep our fuel dry, we must construct heavy, airtight wooden vaults, sealed with toxic black tar and bolted together with expensive iron. They believe that nature is a chaotic enemy that must be aggressively locked out. But Clara, working in the freezing mud with her bleeding, blistered hands, knew the ancient, quiet truth. You cannot fight the winter. If you build a rigid wall to fight the wind will eventually shatter it. If you lock the dampness of the forest into an airtight box, the cold will turn that box into a tomb of ice. Her 6-year-old son, wrapped in a threadbare woolen blanket, sat on a dry stone nearby, watching his mother plunge her raw hands deep into the heavy, dark river clay. She was not digging a foundation for a rigid wooden square. She was shaping a thick, circular berm of earth and river stones, tracing a wide, organic ring in the soil. This was the first masterstroke of her ancestral engineering, the principle of thermal mass and passive geothermics. In the heart of Oakhaven, the wealthy lumber foremen built their $300 firewood sheds on elevated platforms of rigid pine planks, believing that raising the wood off the dirt would protect it. But the air beneath those elevated floors would soon drop to 20 degrees below zero, freezing the wood piles from the bottom up. Clara, however, understood that the earth is a massive, silent furnace. Below the frost line, the soil maintains a constant, stable temperature, insulated by its own immense density. By building a thick, heavy base of solid clay and stone directly upon the earth, she was creating a thermal battery. During the fleeting hours of weak autumn sunlight, the dark river mud would absorb the solar radiation. As the freezing night descended, that heavy earthen base would slowly radiate the captured heat upward, preventing the ground moisture from freezing and creeping into her wood supply. The elite spent hundreds of dollars trying to elevate their wood away from the cold. Clara spent $0 to anchor her wood into the deep, radiant warmth of the planet itself. Once the circular earthen berm was set, Clara began the framing. She did not use heavy, dead, milled pine. She used the living, pliant saplings of the wild willow. Salix. Taking the long, green poles, she buried their thickest ends deep into the wet clay of the berm. Then, with a physical strength born of absolute, terrifying maternal desperation, she bent the tall, flexible poles inward, crossing them at the top, and lashing them tightly together with the heavy hemp twine, the only thing her $7 had purchased. She did not build a square. She built a dome, a perfect, uninterrupted curve against the sky. Why do the wealthiest men build towering flat walls to face a brutal winter storm? It is a failure of physics, born of human pride. When a 60-mile-per-hour freezing wind strikes a flat, rigid wall of milled lumber, the entire kinetic energy of the gale slams directly into the structure. The wood must either resist the devastating force, or it must snap. But a dome possesses the supreme aerodynamic genius of the natural world. When the howling gales of the valley would eventually strike Clara's shelter, the wind would find no flat surface to punish. The curve would violently deflect the kinetic energy, forcing the freezing air to slip smoothly and harmlessly over the top and around the sides. The flexible willow would bend, it would shudder, and it would yield, but it would never, ever break. It is the wisdom of the reed against the wisdom of the oak. The proud oak shatters in the hurricane. The humble reed simply bows and survives. But the true, breathtaking brilliance of Clara's $7 woven shed lay in its walls. As the gray afternoon deepened, she began the wattle, the ancient art of weaving thinner, extremely flexible willow branches horizontally over and under the vertical framing poles. She wove them tightly, pressing them down to create a strong, interlocking shell. Yet she did not seal the walls with mud. She deliberately left thousands of tiny, narrow gaps between the woven branches. It was during this meticulous process that Mr. Higgins, the chief engineer for Silas Thorne's lumber company, drove his heavy horse-drawn wagon past her plot. He was wrapped in a luxurious woolen coat, a man who possessed a university degree and an absolute, unshakable faith in expensive, industrial science. He pulled his draft horses to a halt, looking down at Clara's woven dome with a mixture of pity and supreme, technical mockery. "You are wasting your life, widow," Higgins called out, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Look at those walls. You have left hundreds of holes in your shed. You're letting the winter right into your woodpile. The first freezing rain will blow straight through those gaps, soak your logs, and rot them from the inside out. You need airtight seals. You need thick, overlapping pine boards and heavy iron hinges. How do you expect to keep wood dry when your walls are full of holes?" He attacked her logic, deeply confident in his academic superiority. "Airtight structures keep the wet out, Clara. That is basic science. Your dirt base will freeze, and your little twig basket will let the snow bury your fuel. You are sealing your own fate." Clara did not stop weaving. She did not look up at the arrogant engineer. She simply pulled the rough hemp twine tight, securing another supple branch. "The wood must breathe, Mr. Higgins," she replied, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "If you lock it in the dark, it will drown." Higgins laughed a harsh, dismissive laugh, shook his head at her primitive ignorance, and drove his heavy wagon back to the wealthy, doomed town. Higgins possessed a degree, but he did not understand the intricate, life-saving mechanics of the Bernoulli principle. He did not realize that by building massive, $300 airtight wooden sheds, the lumber elite were creating their own catastrophic weather systems inside their walls. Freshly cut, or even partially seasoned firewood holds deep internal moisture. When you lock tons of wood inside an airtight, freezing pine box, the slight difference in temperature causes that internal moisture to evaporate, hitting the freezing inner walls of the rigid shed. It immediately condenses. The wealthy men of Oakhaven were trapping the humidity inside. The water would drip back down onto the wood, and when the Great Thaw's deadly temperature drop finally arrived, that trapped water would instantly freeze, turning $300 worth of premium firewood into a massive, unbreakable glacier of solid ice. Clara's deliberate gaps were not an error. They were a highly advanced, low-tech dehydration engine. As the violent winter winds would hit the curved exterior of her woven willow dome, the aerodynamic shape would force the air to accelerate as it traveled over and around the curve. According to the laws of fluid dynamics, fast-moving air creates an area of lower pressure. This low-pressure zone on the outside of the shed would act as a powerful, continuous vacuum, literally sucking the heavier, moisture-laden air from inside the woodpile, out through the tiny gaps in the wattle. Even in the dead of a freezing storm, the microventilation of the woven walls would ensure a constant, aggressive cross breeze. the freezing rain would be deflected by the tight, downward-sloping weave of the outer branches, while the internal moisture of the wood would be constantly pulled away by the wind. It was a self-regulating, wind-powered dehydrator. For 3 exhausting, agonizing days, Clara dragged heavy, fallen oak and birch branches from the deep forest, sawing them by hand and stacking them meticulously inside her dry, earthen-floored dome. She stacked the wood in a circular pattern, leaving a hollow chimney of air in the absolute center to maximize the internal draft. Every log was a heavy, physical deposit into the bank of her children's survival. When she finally tied off the last knot of hemp twine, sealing the woven doorway, her hands were trembling and scarred, but her spirit was an unbreakable fortress. She had spent exactly $7. She had used the discarded mud of the riverbank and the wild, untamed weeds that the lumber barons despised. She had built a masterpiece of thermal mass, aerodynamic deflection, and passive ventilation. In the arrogant, towering town of Oakhaven, Silas Thorne and his elite engineers sat by their roaring fires, drinking expensive imported spirits, utterly confident in their heavy iron bolts, their thick pine walls, and their vast financial supremacy. They looked at their ledgers and believed they had conquered the earth. They did not know that high above the dark, jagged peaks of the valley, a devastating atmospheric anomaly was already forming. The warm, wet air from the coast was violently colliding with a brutal Arctic freeze descending from the north. The great silver thaw was coming. The sky was preparing to unleash a merciless, crushing weight of solid ice that would test every ounce of human pride. And when the sky finally broke, the unforgiving laws of physics would not care about the size of a man's bank account. They would only care about the wisdom of his design. The great silver thaw did not arrive with the magnificent, chaotic roar of a traditional winter blizzard. It did not announce its lethal intentions with blinding white flurries or the majestic, sweeping dances of heavy snow. Instead, the judgment of the sky descended upon the valley with a deceptive, whispering, venomous hiss. High above the jagged, pine-covered peaks of the Pacific Northwest, a massive, unyielding front of warm, moisture-laden Pacific air slammed violently into a brutal, stationary, Arctic high-pressure system. It created a terrifying meteorological trap, a temperature inversion. The rain fell from the warm clouds as heavy liquid water, but the air resting just above the valley floor was a staggering 20 degrees below freezing. As millions of heavy raindrops plummeted through this invisible, sub-zero atmospheric layer, they became supercooled. They remained liquid just long enough to strike the earth, but the exact microsecond they made contact with a surface, a branch, a window, a stone, or a rooftop, they instantly, violently crystallized into solid, impenetrable ice. It began at twilight, a relentless, freezing downpour that coated the arrogant, bustling timber town of Oakhaven in a suffocating, glassy armor. By midnight, the entire world had been encased in an inch of solid ice. By dawn, the thickness had doubled. The weight of this silent, creeping accumulation was utterly catastrophic. Inside his grand, towering, 3-story mansion, Silas Thorne stood by his expansive, expensive pane-glass window, a glass of imported amber whiskey, trembling ever so slightly in his hand. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing a terrifying, alien landscape. His beautiful, profitable world of straight lines and absolute control was disappearing beneath a heavy, wet, crushing glaze. But his eyes were not fixed on the dying trees. They were locked in rising, suffocating horror upon the massive, $300 milled lumber woodshed standing rigidly in his courtyard. Silas, like all the arrogant engineers of his elite circle, worshipped the concept of rigid strength. The shed was a massive, heavy, square vault built with thick, unbending planks of premium pine, sealed completely airtight and crowned with a heavy, flat, iron-braced roof. It was designed to stand against the elements like a clenched fist. But physics does not yield to the fists of wealthy men. The relentless, freezing rain poured from the heavens, striking the flat, expansive roof of Thorne's expensive shed. Because the roof was flat, the water had nowhere to run. It simply sat there, and within seconds, it froze. Drop by drop, hour by hour, tons of solid, unyielding ice began to accumulate directly on top of the rigid wooden structure. The massive, thick pine beams began to groan. A low, deep, agonizing sound of timber being pushed to the absolute edge of its structural integrity. Worse still was the invisible, deadly failure happening inside the shed. Silas had demanded an airtight structure to keep the moisture out. But in his supreme arrogance, he forgot that freshly cut and even seasoned wood naturally holds deep internal moisture. As the ambient temperature plummeted to lethal depths, the warmer, humid air trapped tightly inside the sealed $300 wooden box hit the freezing, uninsulated interior walls. Condensation was instantaneous. Thick, heavy beads of water formed on the inside of the shed, dripping relentlessly onto his massive stockpile of premium hardwood. And then, the freezing air penetrated the walls. Inside the dark, expensive vault, the condensation froze solid. The water trapped within the pores of the firewood crystallized, expanding with terrifying, microscopic violence, fusing the logs together. Silas Thorne's majestic, impenetrable fortress of fuel was slowly, silently, transforming into a useless, unbreakable, $300 glacier. Let the pendulum swing now, away from the suffocating dread of the mansion, down to the desolate, unwanted riverbank where the wind howled with a different tune. Here, the storm was just as violent, the rain just as freezing, and the air just as lethal. But inside the tiny, patched-together cabin on the edge of the mud, there was no panic. There was only the soft, rhythmic breathing of a 6-year-old boy sleeping deeply under a warm quilt, and the gentle sighs of an infant cradled against her mother's chest. The air inside Clara's home was heavily laden with the sweet, radiant, life-saving heat of a fiercely roaring hearth. The fire crackled with an aggressive, joyful energy, the flames leaping high and bright, entirely unbothered by the apocalyptic freeze raging just beyond the wooden door. Clara sat in her rocking chair, the golden light painting the soft, tired, but immensely peaceful lines of her face. She did not have a university degree. She did not have imported whiskey or heavy iron vaults, but she had a fire because her wood was impeccably, unbelievably dry. Just steps away from her cabin door stood the $7 miracle of ancestral engineering. The woven dome of wild, living willow saplings was facing the absolute worst fury of the great silver thaw, and it was performing a symphony of perfect natural physics. As the freezing winds, roaring at 60 miles per hour, slammed into the riverbank, they found no flat walls to punish. The kinetic energy of the gale struck the curved, organic shape of the dome and was immediately, smoothly deflected. The wind was forced to wrap around the structure, slipping over the top without transferring its destructive force to the frame. The heavy, freezing rain cascaded down upon the willow wattle, but the steep, continuous curve of the dome offered no flat surface for the ice to pool. The supercooled water slid rapidly down the slick, freezing willow branches, guided naturally away from the center, pooling harmlessly at the thick thermal mass of the clay berm below. The living willow, inherently flexible, simply bent and shivered under the heaviest gusts, absorbing the shock and springing back, an unbreakable dance of yielding strength. But the true victory, the absolute humiliation of Silas Thorne's expensive academic ignorance, was happening through the thousands of tiny gaps Clara had deliberately left in the woven walls. As the violent storm winds accelerated over the curved top of the dome, they created a powerful zone of low pressure, exactly as the Bernoulli principle dictates. This low pressure acted as a relentless aerodynamic vacuum. Even in the freezing, wet chaos of the storm, the invisible hand of the wind was constantly reaching through the woven gaps, pulling the heavier, moisture-laden air completely out of the woodpile. The curved walls blocked the driving rain, but the open weave allowed the internal moisture to continuously escape. Furthermore, the heavy, thick base of river clay and stone, absorbing the deep, stable heat of the earth below the frost line, radiated a subtle, protective warmth upward, preventing the ground frost from ever reaching the bottom layer of her fuel. Her firewood was completely insulated from the freezing earth and aggressively dehydrated by the howling wind. It was not just dry, it was perfectly seasoned by the very storm that sought to destroy it. Back in the heart of Oakhaven, the terrifying crescendo of the Great Thaw finally reached its breaking point. It was 3 a.m. when the temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and the wind shifted from a howl to a demonic, shrieking roar. Silas Thorne paced his freezing parlor, wrapped in 3 heavy coats, his breath pluming in thick clouds of white vapor. The fire in his grand fireplace had died completely. He had sent his foreman out an hour ago to hack away at the ice and retrieve wood, only to discover that the iron hinges of the shed were frozen solid, and the wood inside was a fused, unburnable block of solid ice. The millionaire was freezing in his own castle. And then the sound tore through the valley. It was a sound that would haunt the arrogant men of Oakhaven for the rest of their lives. Crack. It was sharp, violent, and deafening, echoing like cannon fire against the frozen mountains. Silas rushed to the window, his heart hammering in his chest with an alien, icy terror. Out in the darkness of the courtyard, the immense, unnatural weight of the accumulated ice finally overwhelmed the absolute limit of the rigid, unbending pine. A $300 milled timber crossbeam shattered entirely. The structural failure was immediate and catastrophic. Without the ability to bend, the rigid walls buckled outward under the crushing downward pressure. The heavy flat iron roof caved inward with a horrific splintering crash, completely burying Silas Thorne's frozen, useless woodpile beneath tons of jagged ice, twisted iron, and shattered pine. The sound of collapse did not stop there. Down the wealthy, manicured streets of the timber settlement, the night was violently punctured by the rapid, terrifying succession of structural deaths. Crack, snap, crash. One by one, the expensive, rigid, airtight wooden fortresses of the elite succumbed to the brutal physics of their own flawed, arrogant design. They had spent thousands of dollars fighting nature, and nature simply crushed them into splinters. The men who believed they owned the forest, who believed they had conquered the winter with their ledgers and their saws, were suddenly thrust into a desperate, lethal darkness. The psychological collapse was absolute. The wealthy merchants, the university-educated engineers, and the ruthless lumber bosses huddled with their families in the freezing dark of their grand homes, the temperature inside dropping steadily toward 0. Their money was entirely useless. Their silver coins could not spark a flame. Their rigid, unbending pride had literally built the engines of their own freezing demise. Silas Thorne, a man who possessed a fortune large enough to buy the very mountain they stood upon, fell to his knees on his expensive, imported rug, shivering uncontrollably, completely and utterly powerless against the cold. But down by the wild, chaotic riverbank, a $7 woven basket made of mud and twigs stood tall, beautiful, and completely unbroken against the howling dark. Inside the cabin, Clara placed another bone-dry, lightweight log of oak onto the fire. It caught instantly, bursting into a brilliant, aggressive flame that chased the shadows away and bathed her sleeping children in a deep, absolute, and protective warmth. The pendulum had stopped, the earth had spoken, and the arrogance of men lay shattered in the ice. The dawn that broke over the paralyzed valley of Oakhaven was not a morning of triumph. It was a blinding, silent exhibition of absolute devastation. As the first weak rays of the winter sun breached the jagged peaks of the Pacific Northwest, they struck a world entirely encased in a thick, suffocating armor of crystal. The great silver thaw had finished its merciless work. The booming, relentless machinery of the timber empire was completely dead. The massive steel saws were frozen solid in their tracks. The heavy, iron-wheeled locomotives that hauled the wealth of the forest away were welded to the tracks by solid glaciers of ice. But the most profound silence of all emanated from the grand, towering mansions of the lumber elite. Inside his freezing estate, Silas Thorne, the undisputed king of the valley, was a broken man. The temperature inside his luxurious, high-ceilinged parlor had plummeted well below freezing. His breath hung in the dead air like the ghosts of his own shattered pride. Through the frosted glass of his window, he stared at the catastrophic ruins of his $300 milled lumber woodsheds. The heavy, flat iron roofs lay crushed beneath tons of unyielding ice, the rigid pine walls splintered and violently blown out, burying his immense stockpile of expensive, premium hardwood in an impenetrable, frozen tomb. The airtight design he had so arrogantly championed had trapped the moisture, and the resulting internal freeze had fused his firewood into useless blocks of stone. He had millions of dollars in the bank, but he could not buy a single spark of heat to save his shivering family. The brutal, unforgiving mathematics of survival finally forced the millionaire to do the unthinkable. Wrapped in his heavy black bearskin coat, his expensive leather boots crunching agonizingly over the frozen glassy earth, Silas Thorne began the long, humiliating walk toward the riverbank. He did not take his horse. The beast could not walk on the ice. He did not take his foreman. This was a degradation he had to suffer entirely alone. Every agonizing step away from his shattered, rigid empire and toward the marginalized fringes of the town was a heavy, physical blow to his lifelong belief in the supremacy of industrial wealth. When Silas finally reached the desolate, flood-prone plot of land by the river, he stopped completely, his frozen breath catching in his throat. The world around him was a graveyard of shattered, ice-laden oaks and crushed timber, but rising from the frozen mud was a miracle of profound, ancient engineering. Clara's $7 woven willow dome stood absolutely perfect, completely unbroken, and utterly defiant against the cataclysm. The aerodynamic genius of the curved structure was immediately, painfully obvious to the defeated lumber baron. While his flat, rigid roofs had accumulated crushing tons of ice until they snapped, the smooth, organic curve of the living willow had violently deflected the freezing rain. A thin, harmless glaze of ice coated the flexible branches, but the structure itself had simply bent, absorbed the storm's fury, and survived. But it was the sight of the chimney of Clara's patched-together cabin that finally broke the last remnants of Silas Thorne's arrogance. Thick, sweet, steady white smoke was pouring passionately from the stone hearth, curling into the freezing sky, an undeniable banner of life, warmth, and absolute victory. Silas stumbled toward the cabin, his hands numb, his soul hollowed out by the cold. He raised a trembling, leather-gloved fist and knocked weakly on the rough wooden door. When Clara opened the door, a wave of profound, radiant heat washed over the freezing millionaire. It was the heavy, sweet heat of perfectly seasoned, bone-dry oak. Clara stood before him, calm, solitary, and unbroken. She held her infant daughter, deeply asleep and flushed with comforting warmth, against her chest. Her 6-year-old son sat peacefully on the rug behind her, playing in the golden light of the roaring fire. Clara did not wear the triumphant smirk of a conqueror. She wore the solemn, quiet dignity of a mother who had successfully protected her own. Silas Thorne, the man who had heartlessly evicted her into the dying autumn, the man who had openly mocked her desperate labor and laughed at her $7 investment, slowly sank to his knees in the frozen mud of her doorway. He removed his expensive hat, his head bowing under the crushing weight of his own ignorance. "Clara." His voice was a ragged, broken whisper, completely stripped of its former booming authority. "My sheds are destroyed. My wood is frozen solid under the ice. My family, we are freezing in the dark. I was wrong. I was entirely, completely wrong. Please, I will give you $100 for a single cord of your wood. I will give you 1,000. Clara looked down at the broken millionaire, the man who believed that everything, even the laws of thermodynamics, could be commanded by a ledger. She felt no desire for cruel vengeance. True wisdom does not gloat. It simply endures. "Keep your money, Mr. Thorne," Clara said softly, her voice carrying the ancient, unwavering strength of the river. "The earth did not charge me for the willow, and the wind did not charge me to dry the wood. I will not charge you for the heat." She stepped aside, gesturing toward the perfectly intact woven dome just steps away. "The wood is dry. The weave allowed the moisture to escape, just as I told your engineer. The curve broke the storm. Take what you need to keep your family warm. But as you carry it back to your great house, remember that rigid things shatter in the winter. Only those who know how to bend will survive." It was a profound, deeply emotional scene of sublime poetic justice. The wealthiest man in the territory, the master of heavy iron and straight-cut pine, was reduced to a humble laborer, carrying heavy armfuls of life-saving wood out of a $7 low-tech basket woven by the very woman he had cast away as human refuse. The 300-lot industrial fortresses had failed spectacularly, suffocated by their own airtight arrogance. The $7 wattle and daub dome, relying on the Bernoulli principle, passive geothermics, and the deep, silent intelligence of the forest, had saved the lives of the town's elite. This is the great, undeniable legacy of ancestral knowledge. It teaches us that true security does not come from conquering nature with heavy steel and vast fortunes. It comes from deeply understanding nature's language, from working with the wind, the earth, and the flexible grain of the wood. Clara did not just build a shelter for her firewood. She built a monument to the resilience of the marginalized, proving forever that the quiet wisdom of a mother's hands can outsmart the loudest, most expensive machines of men. If this story of profound humility, ancient engineering, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over the arrogance of modern wealth has moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to the Legado Austral channel. Leave your like to help us spread this vital manifesto of resistance, and share this video with anyone who needs to remember that true strength lies in how well we bend, not how rigidly we stand. And before you leave, I want to know, from which city and country are you watching this legacy unfold today? Leave it in the comments below, and let us see where the true guardians of ancestral knowledge are gathering to keep the fire burning. Until our next journey into the past, stay warm, stay observant, and always respect the silent wisdom of the earth.